Good afternoon. Welcome at the Oriental Institute. My name is Ahmed El Shamsy. I'm teaching Islamic thought in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations here in Chicago. And I welcome all of you here for my talk, How Printing Remade the Islamic Tradition. The ideas and the material I'm going to present to you today are part of my ongoing research for my book, which deals with the question of what happens to an intellectual tradition when you change it from one mode of medium to another mode. Let me just put up a timeline. All right, so if we look at this timeline, starting here in the early 7th century, with the emergence of Islam, going up to today, one could start with the question of what is the historical horizon that a language and a literature inhabits. If you think about English, what is the oldest English that, well, on the one hand, that you have read? I would assume probably at school or in college. Or what is the oldest kind of English that you feel comfortable just reading? You know, what kind of bedtime reading that you have? How far can you go back? Is the Bronte sisters, is that already too arcane? Probably, hopefully not. What about Shakespeare? That is already quite different from the kind of English that we speak today. What about Chaucer's Canterbury Tales? That kind of becomes almost a different language in terms of reading practices. So if, for convenience reasons, we talk about the historical horizon of English literature to extend from somewhere around the year 1400, a little bit before the year 1400 until today, we have a spectrum of about 600 years in which English literature is still available to us in its original language. Now, if we look at Arabic, this horizon goes much further back. It goes back all the way, at least to the Quranic, to the text of the Quran, which by no means is exactly the same language as today, but it's definitely a language that can be understood of modern speakers of Arabic. And it is something that is, in fact, still very much alive in everyday usage, Arabic usage. Now, if we look at when Arabic book culture, or Arabo-Islamic book culture began, this is sometimes, properly speaking, we look at sometimes in the 8th century and somehow extending. And if you go to the Regenstein Library and you want to look at Arabic books, you can find anything on this time period, on this scale here, available to us. But the question that I'm asking is, was this always the case? Have people always been able to access this whole range of literature when they were interested in studying Arabic? So to just give you a short introduction into the various, into the written culture that existed in the pre-modern period, as you can see here on this time scale, the Gutenberg, Gutenberg's invention of movable type printing happened sometimes in the 15th century. So this is the beginning when printing really takes off in Europe, right? Because movable type is the technology where you have a set of individual letters and then you combine them to print. Right? Before that there was various types of block printings, very inefficient, and people didn't use them on a large scale. But when Gutenberg developed this in Germany in the 15th century, this led to the so-called Gutenberg Revolution, the introduction of print in Western Europe, which had significant impacts on European intellectual history. I mean, the Reformation wouldn't have happened in the absence of the printed word, pamphlets, works, books, etc. However, the beginning of large-scale Arabic printing is really only in the 19th century. So there's a 500-year gap between the adoption of printing in European languages and large-scale adoption of printing in Arabic. And one of the questions I want to ask in this presentation is, why did that happen? All right. So let's look at it a little bit geographically. We looked at the historical horizon of Arabic book production. Let's look at the geographic horizon. So these are the areas in which, at some point in its history, works in Arabic were produced. This does not mean that these are Arabic countries. It's very different. This is very different. Arabic was the lingua franca, the educated language of the Muslim world for a long time. And so we can see that all the way from Spain, West Africa, East Africa, Arabian Peninsula, Anatolia, into Iran, Central Asia, and India, and into here areas such as today's Indonesia, you have production of Arabic books in the last 1400 years. So it's not just a very wide historical horizon, but also a geographic horizon of book production. The beginning of Arabic written culture, we still have traces of this from relatively early onwards. This is a very old papyrus. It's not one of those that we are keeping here in the OI, but we also have very old papyri here in the OI. I've shown this because it's nice, because it has both Greek in the upper part and Arabic in the lower part. This is a document that was given by an Arab general, Abdullah ibn Jabir, in the year 643 to an Egyptian nobleman over 65 sheep that he took from him. So we are still in the period when the Arabs were conquering parts of Egypt. They still had not conquered the whole of Egypt. 643, that's 11 years after Muhammad's death. So this general is requisitioning these sheep from this local man, but he gives him a document for it, right? So it can be used in the next year. He can deduct this from the taxes he has to pay. And so we have this document. It is housed in Vienna today, and it shows us the beginning of Arabic writing, in the sense of, you still have obviously this Egyptian man. The Egyptian party still writes Greek documents, but the conquerors use Arabic. So these two things are combined in one document. The material on which this is written is papyrus. Papyrus is the writing material of Egypt. It's a plant-based material. It served people in Egypt for thousands of years already before this period. It's cheap. It is not easy to use, and normally it was not used in codices. Codex is a type of book where, basically the kind of book that we're used to today, where you can leaf through. Most of the time, papyri were put into scrolls. You watch medieval movies where people have scrolls. It looks very nice, looks very medieval, but it's very unpractical. If you have a longer book, scrolling through, you have to make two movements. Like with this one, you have to unroll it, and this one you have to roll it. And then when you're at the end, you have to kind of re-roll it again. Like, people in my age and older will remember video cassette, VHS cassettes, which you had to rewind before watching it again. The same thing you had to do with scrolls. So it's not easy to use. So the vast majority of these early papyri that we have are just one page, sometimes fragments of a page, a letter or a document, but very little actual writing of any substance. Then here we have a different writing material, a Quran. This time it's written on parchment. Parchment is not plant material, it's animal material, it's animal skin. Animals don't grow by the side of the Nile. One has to grow them, one has to breed them, and they're expensive. And so this is the earliest datable, so far dated Quran. It's dated to before the year 645, so within a decade and a half after Muhammad's death. Located today in Birmingham, England, in the Bingana collection. Now, the issue with parchment is that it's very expensive. In order to write this particular Quran, one basically needed a herd of something around 140, that's the estimate, about 140 sheep to be slaughtered to write one book. That's expensive if you imagine that in today's prices. So these kind of copies of the Quran were produced for the elite. They were expensive. These were not mass products. Now, we're getting into the age of paper. Sometimes in the 8th century, Muslims coming into contact with the Chinese on the very eastern border of the Muslim empire learned the art of making paper. And this was originally adopted not because it's very useful for ordinary people, not because it's cheaper, that is also true, but because it was forged proof. And one of the issues that the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad had when he sent out orders to the various centers of the various provinces of the empire was that he wrote this on parchment. And if you've ever seen parchment, if you want to erase something on parchment, you just take a knife and you just rub it out. It's skin, animal skin. You just rewrite something. So this is really problematic if you want to govern an empire. And so what they first saw advantageous about paper was that you couldn't do this. You can't just falsify paper like this. You will damage the material itself, and it will be visible that there's forgery going on. So they used paper as a forge-proof material for government business. But when the Abbasids established large-scale manufactures of paper, the ordinary people started to see the advantages of this as well. And so from the mid-8th century onwards, we have really an explosion of book culture, an explosion of books produced in the Muslim world, millions of books written, millions of works written, and tens of millions of books written by hand. Right? These were, there was a whole class of people who were copyists, whose job it was to copy books. There was a whole part of large Muslim cities where the copyists sat in their stalls, and they were also doubling as bookshops. So you could go in there, you could see the latest books, you could point at one and say, I want a copy of this, and then the copyist said, okay, it's going to take me 2 days to do this. You first have to pay up however much money for the materials, etc., and then you can come back in however long time it's going to take me to copy this and pick up your book. This and another advantage of paper is that you can put them nicely into codices. What I've shown you before, these parchment, if you imagine you have a book of parchment, of basically leather, all the pages being leather, you can imagine these books getting incredibly heavy. They're not easy to store, easy to carry around. Paper books, much more handy in that respect as well, lighter. So you have the establishment of huge libraries. We have accounts of libraries that have millions of books in them in the classical period. What about print? Well, forms of print were known even in the pre-modern Muslim world, but these were not, as I said, movable type, but they were a block print. This is an example of what's called tin block print. So there's a surface of tin in which you engrave the letters, and then you use that to print, as in you dip it into ink and then put it on paper. But as far as we know, this technique was never used to produce books. I mean, these are two amulets. These are people, kind of popular religious practice of printing amulets like this on strips of paper that you would roll together and maybe carry in a pouch around your neck. Types of print were known in the pre-modern Muslim world, but movable print was not known, and people continued to write books by hand. All right. Now we're getting to, Muhammad died 632. 900 years later, we're getting into the 16th century. We get three large empires that, among them, hold most of the Muslim world, hold sway over most of the Muslim world. The first ones are the Ottomans. In terms of color, this is not a very useful map. The Ottomans that are obviously starting here in Anatolia, Constantinople is here, or Istanbul, today's Istanbul. They expand eastwards and westwards into southern Europe. And then in 1517, they move into the Arab world. They conquer Syria, Palestine, Egypt, go into North Africa, down into the Arabian Peninsula and into Iraq. So these are the Ottomans take over most of the Arab heartlands, the areas in which people actually speak Arabic. Then you have in the east, today's Iran, the Safavids establishing their realm, and then in parts of India, the establishment of the Mughal Empire. The establishment of the Mughal Empire in India. So these are the three main Muslim empires in the 16th century. Now, what is particular about this development is that you have the three largest political entities are not Arabic speaking. They are Muslim empires. These are empires that consciously consider themselves as being Muslim. But Arabic is not their language. Arabic is not the language of their administration. Arabic is not the language of their bureaucrats, their scribes. The traditional centers of Arabic learning, of Arabic culture, become mere provinces, right? So Damascus, Cairo, Baghdad, here. They become mere provinces. This is one problem. So you have with this, parallel to this, you have the rise of non-Arabic languages such as Ottoman Turkish and Persian. Ottoman Turkish in the Ottoman Empire, Persian in the Safavid and Mughal Empire as the preferred language of culture, which leads to a certain degree of decline of Arabic as a spoken language, as a practiced language by scribes and by bureaucrats. Arabic, however, remains a known language by religious scholars. So in religious seminaries, Arabic remains the primary language of exchange. So Muslim scholars continue to learn Arabic and write in Arabic. From the 17th century, with the rise of European trade, with the discovery of the New World, with the circumnavigation of Africa, which means that Europe can now access India and China without having to go through the Middle East, you have an economic decline in the Arab heartlands, which means you have a decline of populations, going together with the outbreak of various diseases. The plague ravages the Middle East several times in the 17th and 18th century, to the effect that in the late 18th century, Egypt, for example, has only 3 million inhabitants. When Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798, Egypt has only 3 million inhabitants. That's a quarter of the population that it had only 500 years earlier. And this has all kind of negative effects. It has negative effects on educational institutions. Right? The educational institutions in medieval Muslim lands were financed similarly, actually, to for a long time what happened with, for example, Oxford and Cambridge in England, through agricultural endowments. Right? So parts of the land were endowed to these educational institutions, and the profits of these lands were given to these educational institutions. The professors were paid, the students got scholarships, etc. Now, with this population decline, economic decline, many of these educational institutions collapsed, which also led to a decline of the academic life in these places. Many fewer students, many fewer professors, many fewer books. Nevertheless, we do see some instances in which people started to print books. So here, this is a 18th century project by an Ottoman entrepreneur, Ibrahim Mutafarrika, who set up a printing press in Istanbul. And this is the official permission he got for printing an Ottoman Arabic dictionary. There are several obstacles, practical obstacles for Arabic printing that you don't have in Latin print. One of them is that in Latin print, you have every letter, you just need two forms, right? Uppercase, lowercase, that's all it is. In Arabic, each letter has different forms depending on where you have them in the word. You have a form if the letter appears at the beginning of the word. You have a form if it appears at the end of the word. You have a form if it appears in the middle of the word. There is issues of spacing because the letters are connected. As you can see, the letters are connected here, for example. There are issues of spacing that are difficult to solve if you want to have movable type printing. So that's one challenge. But the other challenge is also if you have areas that have a large area with most of the people working in agriculture, you have few centers, with population decline, you have few centers where people gather. You have a multiplicity of written languages. Producing books becomes less and less economically viable. So even though we see these entrepreneurs taking up print from time to time, we don't really see anything similar to the print revolution that we see from 15th century Europe onwards. It is really only in Egypt in the early 19th century, when the Egyptian government founds a printing press, that print starts to suddenly explode in the Middle East. Why is that? First of all, this is the Middle East after Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, and the French stayed there for 3 weeks, if only, 3 years. So the Middle Eastern societies had come into contact with European states that through modernization had become very powerful. Europe had been a cultural, economic, military backwater for many centuries, but now suddenly these modern armies that were equipped with modern weapons, that were organized and that had modern logistics, with centrally trained officer corps, etc., proved themselves to be superior in terms of force of arms. So we have various establishments of modern states in the Middle East that sought to emulate modern states in particularly France. And so we have the same process in Egypt, where Muhammad Ali, not the boxer, established modern Egypt. And one of the tools of this state formation, of a new Egypt with a modern bureaucracy, quasi-independent of the Ottomans, was the printing press. And so we see this is the first book printed in Egypt. It doesn't look very Arabic, does it? I mean, even the place where this print, here says Bolacco. What is that place? Anybody knows Bolacco? Sounds like bologna. No, it's not. Bolacco, that's the Italian version of Bulaq. Bulaq is the harbor of Cairo. That's where the first printing was established. And this is a dictionary, Italian-Arabic dictionary. Why was that needed? Because many of these, the early engineers and the early things imported from Europe were imported from Italy. Italy was just across the Mediterranean, just up from the Mediterranean. So Italian was a very useful language to know, so the Italian-Arabic dictionary was printed. And so for the first 25 years of the establishment of this press, it printed primarily textbooks for educating officers, for educating engineers, for educated doctors. Many of these books were translated from European languages. So what I'm saying is, for the first quarter of a century, print didn't have much of an influence on Islamic thought. The traditional Islamic works were not printed in the first 24 years. Even, I mean, what is very interesting to look at is, this is a work on arithmetic translated from French, but if you look at the form of this print, it looks almost like a manuscript. These are the old ornamentations that you would see on an Arabic manuscript. It starts with the Basmala, in the name of God, the most merciful. So at the beginning of print, even the visuals of manuscripts were used in even something as profane as translation from French on issues of arithmetic. Egypt was not the only place that started printing. There were other places. This is India, 1847. Now, this looks a little different, no, from what I just showed you. This is not movable type print. If you look before that here, this is movable type. So this is, every letter put together on metal, as a metal letters put on a wooden board and then used to print. This is something else. This is what it's called lithography. This was a technique that in Europe was used to mostly to print posters. Was here used for printing books. The way they did this was they took a soft type of stone and they engraved on that stone, and then they used that to print. So these lithographies, they look like manuscripts. You see, this looks like the main text here is like this, and then you have commentaries kind of added here in various angles. Places like India, Iran, and on the very other side of the Muslim world, Morocco, the beginning of print was in fact lithographs rather than movable type printing. But movable type printing proved to be much more cost efficient. One of the issues of lithography is that you can only use this stone for so many prints. It's something around 500 prints. Then the stone becomes blunt, and then you can't use it anymore. With movable type, you can print as many copies as you want to, almost infinitely. So after about a quarter of a century in which the printing press in Egypt worked on basically just as a tool of the Egyptian state, what the states, when the state printing expanded, what the state noticed is that, a lot of time the printing presses aren't used. There are times during the day in which they're not used because we're not printing all the time. So we could have people come in and print other books if they give us money. It's effectual, saves cost for the state. So the Egyptian state starts permitting private people to print books on their machines. So we see that Islamic literature becomes available in print from the 1850s, 1860s onwards. So this text is very much representative of the kind of scholarship of the preceding 2-3 centuries. These are commentaries. In fact, these are several layers of commentaries. This is a commentary by a scholar from the 19th century on a commentary that somebody had written in the 16th century on a basic text from the 12th century. So these are 3 layers of commentary on top of each other. These are, as you can imagine, very technical things to read. You can't just pick it up and read 3 intertwined commentaries onto each other. These are very technical, scholastic texts that were used in the religious seminaries at the time. And so they were not primarily old texts. I've shown you the time scale at the beginning. These were relatively new texts that were picked up by religious scholars. Now, what actually happened to the old texts? Where did the old texts go? All these, I showed you at the beginning these old papyrus and parchments and so on and so on. And if you paid attention, I could ask you, where did the papyrus I showed you, where was that from? What city? Vienna. So somebody was not asleep, thank you. So this is a page from an early Quran that is from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And so this is the very nice old Kufic Hijazi script. And then on the side, there's a marginal note that I translated here. Which says, "This is an endowment placed in the ancient mosque of Old Cairo and sacrosanct forever. It is forbidden for anyone to borrow it, replace it with another copy, sell it, gift it, or inherit it, until God inherits the earth and its people," i.e., for all intents and purposes, never. Right? So how did it end up in Paris? Well, the same way as the papyrus ended up in Vienna, the same way as all these other things ended up in primarily Europe, but then later on in the United States, namely in the 19th and early 20th century. These specific pieces in the Bibliothèque Nationale came to France through Napoleon's invasion. So Napoleon Bonaparte, when he went to Egypt, who were his experts, who could speak Arabic? They were the Orientalists, French Orientalists, and they went there with an army, and if they wanted a book, they just took it. Right? And these people, they left accounts of going into this, in the central mosque of Old Cairo and just taking the stuff. And who could oppose them? This was stuff that had been there for 1,000 years before that, endowed to the libraries of these places, but the French took them by force. So there is instances in which these things were taken by force. The British, after putting down what the British call the mutiny, the Indian mutiny, against British rules in India, 1857, basically plundered the Mughal court library and brought it all to England. So it's part of the British library now. So several of these large libraries were taken, were just robbed from the Middle East. Many of them were also bought. I've mentioned to you that educational institutions had collapsed in the preceding centuries, and so many of these institutions that had a proper library, that had a paid librarian to look after the books, suddenly didn't have anything like this anymore. So it was easy for Europeans, very often these were European consuls. That term doesn't exist today anymore. They used to be diplomats that Europe sent to various places in the Middle East. But it was very strange, and they didn't actually get paid. So they had so if you were the Prussian consul in Damascus, you had an official status, but you actually didn't get a salary. So where did you get your salary? You had to make money. And one way of doing this was trading manuscripts, buying manuscripts as cheap as you can locally. You had political power, right? The whole power of a large European country was behind you. And you could sell this stuff. And in the 19th century, Arabic manuscripts were incredibly sought after. They were incredibly sought after. There is a Swiss diplomat sold a collection of 1,000 Arabic manuscripts to the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin in the late 19th century. He got so much money for it that for an ordinary worker it would take 100 years of work. For an ordinary German worker, he would have to work 100 years to get this money. When the Bavarian State Library bought the manuscripts of one prominent French Orientalist, he asked so much money for it that they had to sell 20,000 books of European books that they had. Among the books they sold was their Gutenberg Bible. In order to buy, you see today, I heard if you get hired today in the Bavarian State Library, that's one of the questions. What would you have done? Would you have taken the Arabic manuscripts, or would you have sold the Gutenberg Gutenberg Bible? But anyway, so this was really sought after stuff, and so you had these consuls who had political backing and had an economic interest. Serving as go-betweens, and large, maybe something around 100,000 manuscripts were brought thereby to France, to England, to Germany, to Sweden, and then from the early 20th century also to the United States. At that time, there were no laws in Middle Eastern countries that would forbid the export of manuscripts, even if they were extremely rare. And the interesting thing is that these Orientalists were particularly interested in the oldest stuff, that were the rarest things. They were not interested in the most recent books. They were interested in as old as possible. So there was a real drain of works that happened in the 19th century. So at the same time, we have the birth or the rise of print, but at the same time, much of the literature is actually disappearing from the Middle East. So one person who was particularly, who experienced this particularly strongly was Rifat al-Tahtawi. He was an Egyptian who was sent on an educational mission to Paris in the 1820s, late 1820s. And he realized that a lot of the Middle Eastern heritage was leaving to Europe. One of the things he saw in Paris, I don't know if you've been to Paris, the big obelisk that is prominently displayed in Paris, but he also saw the manuscripts that were in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and so when he returned and he got a good position in the Egyptian government, he pushed the agenda of printing classical works, printing old works, in order to bring them back into intellectual circulation. One of these books was Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, the Prolegomena, which was printed in Cairo in 1857. The Muqaddimah is a 14th century text by a man called Ibn Khaldun, one of the great intellectuals. People described him as the founder of sociology. His work is an incredible study of the way societies work, the way societies rise and fall. Famously, Ronald Reagan in his long anti-tax speech quoted Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun made the point that high taxes are characteristic of declining states because they try to make up for their declining business. Think about that, right? Any presidential candidate these days quoting an Arab intellectual of the 14th century, unfortunately, not thinkable anymore today. So that was a major landmark achievement, 1857, the first time this book was printed. One of the problems these printers had, though, was that they didn't have good copies. So one of the things here on the margin you can see on this page here, this margin, in early print they didn't have footnotes, they used marginal notes, which I think is kind of, in fact, it's more commonsensical to do. What the printers here, what the corrector does at the marginal note, he explains the problems they had with manuscripts. They had a very bad copy. All the good I mean, the thing about, I mean, this copy of the Muqaddimah was written in Cairo in the 14th century, but all the, and we in fact have an autograph. We have a manuscript with the handwriting of the author, but that's now in Istanbul, right? So the Ottomans took that with them in the 16th century. And we have other very good copies, but they're in Paris. But the place where it was written in Cairo actually only had a really recent copy, with a lot of mistakes. And he was fortunate that he found a handwritten copy in the library of a Moroccan friend of his, so the corrector of this press. So happened to have a friend who had a manuscript copy, so he could use that to collate these two. But you can see that in the early print, this was a very problematic thing to do. You know, people wanted to. There was a movement to print early books, but where were they? Most of the time, they were not in the Middle East. So what was there to be done? Now, this is 1868. You have the emergence of these scientific societies. This was basically a kind of a type of book club that you could join. People were interested in reading classical works. They paid a yearly subscription to this, and with that money, this society was looking for early books and printing them, and then the members got them at a reduced price. So this is a list. This list has 800 members, and 2 years later it had over 1,200 members. So this was and if you look at who these people were who were interested in these books, these were bureaucrats. These were people who were part of this modernizing state, who had who did not have a seminary education, who were not brought up in a seminary primarily. They were bureaucrats. They were interested in things to read, literature, not in commentaries on commentaries on commentaries, but they were interested in literature. And they were not, I mean, they might have also read translations from other languages that were also produced at this time, but they were interested in classical thought that were readable to them, as I explained at the beginning. You could read poetry or prose that was 1,000 years old if you could only get your hands on it, right? That was the issue. So one of the people in this story, and there are many, and I'm just giving you this one as an example, is Ahmed Zaki. Pasha is his title. He made a career in the Egyptian government. He became the secretary of the Egyptian cabinet, so a high-level government official. But he also became very much interested in scholarship. He was a book collector. He assembled a large library with tens of thousands of manuscripts that, after his death, were donated to the Egyptian National Library. The book on the right here is his account of his visit to the Paris World Fair in 1900. So he was also very much interested in Western things. He visited Orientalist congresses in Europe, and he was dedicated to take back the literary heritage of Arabs and Muslims from Europe. How did he do this? Did he steal anything? No, he did not. He used photography. Sorry, that was at a time when, to my knowledge, Western scholars were not actually interested in that at all, he took cameras to European libraries and photographed manuscripts on a large scale. Tens of thousands of manuscripts he photographed, brought them back to Egypt, and deposited them in his personal library, which was open to everybody, which was publicly available. Now, this text is quite interesting. It's text on ethics that he published in 1911. The story of this text is quite interesting, and I think it exemplifies the problems that I mentioned before. So he found this text in 1908 when he went to Istanbul. And in 1908 there was a constitutional coup or revolution in Istanbul, which meant that for the first time for 400 years, an outsider could go into the palace of the Ottoman Sultan, the Topkapi Palace, and consult the library there. So the library, which had been limited to members of the palace, was now for one summer available to Ahmed Zaki, and he went there with a team of people. They made, again, thousands of photographs there, and he found the copy of this work that had been unknown before. So he found a copy of a work from the 8th century, so more than 1,000-year-old, that was hidden in this Sultanic library, and he brought it back to Egypt. He edited it with, he puts his own name here at the front page, and because he's a member of the Egyptian government, he succeeds in making this a compulsory reading for all secondary school students in Egypt. So within the period of 3 years, a book that was over 1,000 years old goes from being unknown, totally unknown, to being read by every single student in the Egyptian public school system. And that's the power of print, that you can do this. If you imagine a manuscript culture is dependent on individual demand, on individuals copying a text. The powerful thing about print is that even if one copy survives, it can be available within a year in thousands of copies. In a manuscript cultures are much more conservative in that sense. If there are a lot of copies, people will copy it a lot. But if there's only one copy left, it's much more unlikely for this book to quickly be disseminated. To conclude, when observing the shift from a manuscript to a print culture in the Arab lands, we witness first a renaissance of Arabic as the dominant language of cultural and intellectual exchange. With print in the Arab countries, it is really the dominance of Arabic that you see after a time in which Ottoman and Persian had dominated the bureaucracy. So you have a renaissance of Arabic. And second, you see a shift in the literary horizon from works produced in the period between the 16th and 19th century to earlier works. It is these works brought to the forefront through the processes of the 19th and early 20th century that now constitute for us what we consider the classics of Islamic thought. Thank you.